FREES it's a collective of people who are interested in wild horses. It includes managers, it includes scientists, it includes private citizens, organizations, ranchers, anybody who wants to be involved with the wild horse issues. We are an organization that is collaborative, though, and we are striving for healthy humans, healthy wild horses, and healthy Western landscapes. The purpose of this webinar is not to beat you over the brow with the sage on the stage, because I really hate being that person. But it is to provide an educational information in a safe learning environment. We encourage you to ask questions and engage in respectful discussions. We really would like to promote our growing collaborations. We want to connect you with new people within this organization and even potentially outside this organization, and foster that networking amongst our diverse stakeholders. And specifically, we really want to connect people in a way that they can meaningfully be involved in. That will be different. That will look different for every single person. We all have our own special skills and characteristics that we embody as a person. And so we would like to connect you best where you can plug into this issue. Right. So this is our first interactive slide. You can, you'll see on your screen that you have some selections. How are you feeling today? 5 is kind of feeling great. 1 is feeling like, not so much. You can make your selection. We can see down on the bottom how many of you are making your selections, so I won't go on until you've made your selections. All of you who want to, like most of you here. Average span is 4, okay? I could understand that, especially seeing as that we have some furloughed feds here, so that's actually pretty higher than I would have expected. All right, Celeste.
All right, first of all, we were able to take a look at the list of folks that signed up today, and it is an impressive list of recognizable names of a lot of you all who are deeply invested in and involved in the wild horse issue, from the very, very officially to the very, very unofficially. So good on all of you for showing up and for doing the multiple different sorts of things that are necessary and occurring around wild horses. I wanted to dig in just a little bit. This is not going to be comprehensive or exhaustive, but in thinking about how people have a connection or a relationship with horses in general, and in particular wild horses, I've talked to a lot of people about where those connections come from and just what is it about wild horses, which is hard to nail down. I think all of us have our spirit, our sort of Hollywoodization of this, arguably highly romanticized stories of the West. And some of the ones that come to mind to me are Bucephalus and Trigger and Seabiscuit and Black Beauty and Silver. And this might be way out there and only with the 80s crowd, but Artax. But these horses have been this unifying and connecting creature for a lot of people through these big Hollywood produced stories around them, but that's not all that they are, and that's not the only place that relationships with wild horses come from, of course. I want to use Spirit as just an example. Spirit was an animated movie that was released by DreamWorks Pictures in 2002. It was this new technology of very traditional old school animation, hand-drawn sort of Disney-style animation, enhanced with computer animation. And so this was new at the time for animators and the folks that do all the technical and software stuff around these movies. And when animators were beginning to draw these horses, they were figuring out that they were actually kind of hard to capture. But let me back up and just give you the 1-minute version of the story of Spirit from this movie. Please know that this is a movie story. So Spirit is born into a band of Kiger Mustangs, which I think probably everyone on this webinar is familiar with. They're a sort of storied group of wild horses in the Kiger herd management area that the BLM manages in Oregon. They're known for being these sort of earthen tones, duns, have the dorsal stripe down their back, dark manes and tails. And they're sort of indicative of a type of horse that can be found in some of these management areas, and some of which do have some of this Spanish heritage in their gene pool. So they're very interesting horse. They tend to be very friendly when they are adopted by people or worked with. So Spirit was born into this band of Kaigers, and he eventually becomes the lead stallion for his herd. He's captured by the U.S. cavalry. This is taking place in 1887. This is the beginning of the film. But he cannot be broken by the wranglers. A captured Lakotan named Little Creek helps him to escape. They develop a relationship of sort of guarded mutual respect. Little Creek also cannot break Spirit, but they really seem to appreciate one another. Little Creek then eventually sets Spirit free, but he is captured again by the cavalry. There's some drama back and forth with who's captured by who and who's trying to help where, and it ends up that Little Creek and Spirit once again are escaping the cavalry together. There's a dramatic leap across the Grand Canyon. The cavalry colonel sees this occur, and he and Spirit sort of reach this mutual understanding that this is a freedom that cannot be broken, and Spirit heads off into the sunset with his herd, who he's reunited with. This film was a big deal. I actually didn't see it when it came out, and I'll get to that story in a second, but it was for that generation of kids who grew up watching Spirit. It was their, story of Seabiscuit or Black Beauty or Black Stallion. It really was compelling for people and very meaningful for kids that grew up with this movie. One kid told me, well, they were an adult when they told me that they sat through and watched it something like 4 times in a row at the theater when it came out. So next slide. So as I said, the animators were very uncertain about how to draw this horse. And so they actually purchased a horse for use by the animators to experience and watch and sort of try to capture his personality, the way he moved, the way a mane would float in the wind, all of these sort of nuances about horses and movement. And so Spirit was actually purchased from a Kiger facility. His parents were wild caught, but he was not. And then he was trained by a renowned horse trainer. And the intention of DreamWorks was to, when the film was released, to actually take Spirit and sort of have him present at some of the premieres and visiting various places. Well, that turned out to be a little bit cost prohibitive, so he didn't end up going on this tour, but he does know a great deal. Evidently, and I don't know where this is in my brain or where this information came from, but evidently he had been trained to ride elevators up and down. I'm not sure why. But DreamWorks sort of reached this place where they were like, well, we have this horse, the movie is done. We don't really need to have a horse anymore, but he means something. His story means something to people. And they wanted him to be someplace where people could visit him. And so they began investigating places where they thought he might make a good place for him. And they actually reached out to the organization that I currently work for, Return to Freedom, and came and visited the site and decided that that was the place for Spirit. And good grief, I can't believe when he arrived. I think it was something like 2004. So just a few years after the film. And this is what I'm getting to with this whole long story. He is a magnet for people. People come from all over the world to come and visit with and meet Spirit. And he has served as this ambassador of the connection that people have with horses and with wild horses. Again, Spirit is living in a sanctuary, but he's tied to this story that is so compelling to people. In fact, Spirit has been named He was inducted into the Horse Stars Hall of Fame in 2018 by the Equus Foundation and the U.S. Equestrian Federation. It's kind of fun. And again, he's just this magnet for people. Spirit is 30 years old, still residing at the ranch. This photo is just from a couple of years ago. He is in fabulous shape. He is an older gentleman in horse years, but he is quite stunning. Go ahead, next slide, Amanda. So with that sort of background, just this sort of storied connection that people will feel to specific horses or to wild horses. Again, what is it about wild horses? And these are words that pop up for people. And when you sort of dig into books or presentations about horses and their history with people in America, these are the sorts of themes that arise again and again and again. And I'm just going to go into a few of them for a little bit of background, but again, not exhaustive background. That would be a whole series of webinars in and of itself, that sort of story of horses in America and story of horses and domestication and use by human culture throughout time. That's a big one. When we think about the cultural and historic background of horses with Americans, of course, there's the 1971 Act that I think everybody on this webinar is familiar with, and which we will dig into in greater detail in other webinars. But the defining reason for the Act was this cultural and historic significance of wild horses to Americans. And so it protected horses and burros on the landscape as a matter of importance to Americans, pure and simple. We have a connection with wild horses. Horses were brought back to the New World, and that's another story for another webinar, but in the 1500s by Spanish explorers, and then spread braided fashion across what's now the United States via many means, and there's not 100% agreement on the exact timing of that. One of the biggest spreads of horses, escaped horses across the United States was during the Pueblo Uprising of 1860. Native Americans who had been enslaved by the Spanish rose up to defeat their captors, and they had actually been the caretakers of these horses at these missions. And so they actually knew a great deal and were able to utilize the horses in this uprising. And then the horses spread throughout tribes across the West and the plains. There is recent archaeological evidence to suggest that maybe that story is not quite right, that actually horses were embedded in more tribal cultures and more deeply before that uprising. But the point is, there were many different ways horses were spreading across the United States. Because of the push west by Euro-American settlers from that traditional East Coast location where they had been, and an encouragement to move west by the government at that time, barbed wire was also being laid out across the West, and that was pushing and moving animals into specific areas. And so we did have horses sort of that were everywhere, now concentrated more in the West. And so they have become part of this Western culture and lore, and were heavily utilized in the West and regarded in the West. Another thing that I wanted to talk about in this sort of how Americans think about wild horses is that Colorado State University and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are involved in a multi-state conservation. The multi-state conservation grant program has provided those two entities with funding for a project called America's Wildlife Values. And this has been a large-scale human dimensions project to look at how Americans' values around wildlife have shifted. And for argument's sake, I'm going to put wild horses into that same category, because what that has shown is that for a long time, the sort of the two values that are sort of highlighted in this study, because they are the most common ones, This one of, and these are just terms, domination or traditionalism is viewing wildlife as a resource to be managed and used for human benefit. And mutualism is this value of valuing animals as companions and part of our own social networks. Well, when this survey first began I think it was about 15 years ago, the lead value for Americans and wildlife was the domination traditionalism value. This whole study has been done again recently, I think 6-ish years ago, and I'm so sorry if I'm wrong on these times. You can look this up on their website. And mutualism is the value that is highlighted by Americans more now. And so our whole view has shifted in America about the role of animals around us and for us. And I would argue that the same goes for horses, regardless of how you think about them as wild or feral or free roaming or native or not native or reintroduced, however you think about them. They have, along with everything else that Americans are thinking about animals, have come along with this view of a more mutualistic lens that we are looking at horses through now than we did maybe even just 20 years ago. What that does, that trend shift in the US, is going to also mean a shift in how natural resource managers think about these animals on our landscapes. They're not quite, it's not the same thing as it was 20 years ago. And finally, freedom and resilience. I think this impactful imagery around horses. I mean, I think about over and over again those scenes in The Misfits where they're chasing them across. My gosh, I think they filmed that in Death Valley, that very famous scene. But we really place this sort of survival and resilience thoughts, phrases, values around wild horses. And that's very American also. I think Americans think of themselves as survivors and getter-doners, and horses capture that for sure, or they do for many people. They also inspire a sense of awe. I think anybody on this webinar who has seen wild horses out in these places and has seen how rugged these places are and has seen horses perched on the edge of cliffs looking like mountain goats, I mean, they do strike awe into even the most pessimistic of us. And there is research at UC Berkeley to show that a sense of awe directly translates to more empathy, to better personal wellness, to a lowered blood pressure. I mean, it is important to have awe and hope around us so that we are making our way in the world in, a healthy and empathetic manner. So we have a long relationship with horses as Americans. They have done work for us. They have been our partners as companions or as workers. They have been athletes. And now they are also just very, very symbolic of the sort of freedom and resilience that is incredibly important to American people. So with that, I think I'm handing it back off to Amanda, or maybe I will see when the next slide comes up.
Actually, I think the next slide is an interactive slide. So this is time for you guys to pick up your phones. When you think of wild horses, what words come to your mind? You can enter as many words as you want. There's no right or wrong answer. Just what comes to your mind when you think of wild horses? That's some really, really good terms here. And you can see that it spans a wide range of feelings and emotions and invokes a wide range of feelings for people all across the spectrum. So I'm going to shift a little bit. I always get to be the one that does. Celeste gets to do the really fun and touchy-feely good stuff. And I always get saddled with the really boring stuff. But I do want to give a little bit of background. I know that a lot of you on this webinar are experts in the field. I will not be telling you anything new. Hopefully I get it all right. And if I don't, you can certainly correct me, especially if you can especially use the chat function or the Q&A function, I'm sorry. This webinar is meant to be the introduction, the springboard into more of a series of educational webinars. We are going to explore how horses function within their environment, what their environment looks like, where do horses live, what do their habitats look like. And so, but you have to have a little bit of background for this, because when we say wild horses, it means lots of different things to people emotionally, but it also means lots of different things legally. So with that, what is a wild equid, whether it's a horse or a burro or a mule? We'll start with the simplest definition, which is wild with a capital W. Wild with a capital W in this webinar series will refer to horses and burros that are managed under managed under one of the two named federal agencies in the Wild Horse and Burro Act, as Celeste mentioned earlier. They are afforded protections under the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971. Some people refer to animals out on the landscape as this could mean any number of terms. A feral animal is generally one that was domesticated and then now is found in some other environment, some wilder environment. Wild with a lowercase w can mean any horse out on this landscape, not necessarily one that falls under the protection of the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. To encompass sort of all these definitions, we at FREES have obviously chosen to use free roaming, whether these horses are managed as the capital W wild or the lowercase w wild. It includes all these critters out on the landscape, regardless of where they reside. Estray, you may hear this term especially if you're familiar with Nevada. It is a term that the state of Nevada uses in the state herd here as well. So let's talk about the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971. It was passed unanimously in Congress, affording protections to wild horses and burros found in designated public lands to protect wild horses. Congress, as Celeste said, Congress recognized that these critters out on the landscape were living symbols. They embody our spirit of freedom, the ruggedness and the toughness of the settlers coming west and making a living out in these sort of harsher, arid Western landscapes. It is very specific in the protection that it provides, and it protects specifically those horses that are managed by either the Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management or the Department of Agriculture's U.S. Forest Service. I will talk a little bit about acronymology in the next couple slides. It's one of my favorite terms because you cannot interact with the federal government without speaking acronymies. So just a little bit of the who's who if you're a little new to this issue, in which we welcome you into this group. The Department of Interior, the Bureau of Land Management is one of the primary players. They manage the majority of the areas where horses are found, as well as the majority of the population. I think it's a little bit lesser known, but the Forest Service is also legally charged with responsibility of animals on their lands. They are under the Department of Agriculture, and because you have two different departments, you sometimes have a little bit of differences in policies, procedures, and of course, acronyms. Other folks who end up managing horses, the National Park Service. Theodore Roosevelt National Park actually has horses in the park that they manage. Some of our sovereign tribes across the West have horses that are under their jurisdictions. And also the state of Nevada has a state herd, as I said, that is an estray herd, the Virginia Range herd. Other players to this who kind of get involved are some of the counties that are involved where these horses are at, the other states besides Nevada. Some of the other federal agencies, USGS is involved with some of the research, and some of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service often is a player in some of these fields. And even municipalities, if you are a resident of Reno or Las Vegas, you know that horses, or some of the towns in Arizona, you know that horses and burros can frequently make their appearances in very urban areas. And so there's a lot of players in this. So where the animal is found is very dependent on who is the manager of that particular animal. who's responsible for its welfare. And so it does get a little bit confusing. All right. I told you I'd do a little acronymology. This is just your basic acronyms that is sort of broad to the Wild Horse and Burro program. If you see the acronym WHB anywhere, it generally means just Wild Horse and Burro. AML is the appropriate management level. This is a term that is used by both the Forest Service and the BLM to designate how many horses a particular area can sustain without causing ecological damage. It can be a contentious term, and we'll get into some of that in many later webinars, but I wanted to put that term out there just so that you guys know if anybody talks about AML, that's what it means. NEPA. NEPA is my favorite. You can use it as a noun, verb, or adverb. It stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. It is a legal policy. It was congressionally mandated, but it has regulatory intent. If you are curious what regulatory intent is, you can tune in I think it's January, and I will bore you to death with public policy. Just kidding. I will try and make it very interesting as one can make public policy. But the National Environmental Policy Act had vague language, and so it leaves these multiple interpretations for implementation about what it means to be compliant within that particular act. All federal agencies are required to be compliant within the National Environmental Policy Act, and it was enacted to really give the public a broader understanding about what actions were happening out on federal landscapes. The BLM is the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service is USFS, as I use them in these abbreviations. Sometimes they have others, but this is how I will use them in this particular series. And of course, because you have two different agencies managing, we always have to have our own interpretations of this. They are essentially the same things. If you hear the term HMA, it stands for Herd Management Area. It is what is defined as an area that is designated principally, though not exclusively, for the management of wild horses and burros. It is not the same in the Forest Service, unfortunately. It is called, the Forest Service uses the term WHBT, which is a wild horse and burro territory. They are essentially legally the same things. There are minor differences in how agencies are mandated to manage them, particularly as it comes down to individual policies within the agency. The act is the same for both agencies, but individually within the agencies, there are different policies. So some of you may know this, some of you may not. This is a quiz question, although the only thing you'll get is bragging rights if you get it right. How many states are home to wild with a capital W horses and burros as defined by the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971? Is it all 50 of them, 37, 11, or 3? Since we have all the experts on, I'm assuming that most people will get this correct. Most of us here, you said 11, and you are correct. Excellent work. Wild horses and burros are found in 11 Western states. All right. I'll turn it back to Celeste. She's going to wrap it up with a roadmap. And if we have any questions that have been submitted through the Q&A, we'll go through those. And otherwise, we have one more interactive slide, so don't leave before that, please. Because you get the chance to guide how some of this is going to go. We want to develop these in mind with what you want to know. And so we're going to give you that opportunity here in a minute.
So for the next handful of webinars, we're just laying down the basic landscape of horses and wild horses, so that when we move on to more technical or more specific or research-oriented or project-oriented presentations, we can all have the same rough background. So in November, we're going to have Dr. John Madigan of Distinguished Professor Emeritus from UC Davis, talking about basic horse biology. I highly recommend you tune in for that webinar. Dr. Madigan is a wonderful speaker, very fun to listen to, and he has been involved in the veterinary, equine, welfare, neurology risk management and incident response involving large animals for a number of years. So we're going to sort of take a step back. I think a lot of us might work with wild horses and wild horse research, but are just sort of general knowledge of horses and their needs and how they're made up and how their physiological systems are operating. We're going to sort of take a step back and dig into that a little bit. December, we're going to talk about the differences between wild and domestic horses and that story as well. So a little bit of the domestic horse background and domestication of horses, and a little bit about wild horses, primarily in America, but in other parts of the world as well. January is going to be Dr. Gearhart. That's yours, isn't it? Yes. Sort of background of public lands and policy, and sort of how we got to the point of the 1971 Wild Horses and Burros Act. And then a little bit beyond that as well. And that all these acts and policies actually also have quite a bit to do with that act. And that act has to take into account quite a few of those policies. So sometimes things that seem like, oh gosh, no brainer, simple answer. Why aren't we doing things this way? Well, there's a lot of things around that that might make it undoable or unreasonable or okay, but that's going to take you 20 years and a lot of amendments. So sort of getting a better handle on how and why these things are set up the way that they are. February, we're going to look more at the ecology that surrounds wild horses. Where are wild horses and what are those habitats like? And what are those ecosystems experiencing and doing? What makes them resilient or resistant or not resilient or resistant to lots of things, including our own human uses of those lands? And in March, Dr. Gearhart again is going to talk about the art and science of public land management. When you are making a decision about any management action on public lands, it is not black and white, and it is not 100% science, and it is not 100%, special interest or someone's greatest idea or opinion. It is a very tough blending, and it is a lot of people and policy and law involved in every single decision. So that is the beginning. Us as a steering committee, and then us as the greater community of people who would like to participate in FREES. We want your input. We will be reaching out to different areas of expertise for future webinars. We will be hosting a specific new research around wild horses webinar quarterly at least, and then lots of other stuff around wild horses and burros throughout those remaining months. So please don't think that this is it or that we think we know it all. We definitely don't. We're going to lay groundwork together, and we're going to hope for your input and continue to develop how we seek and receive input so that we can really streamline this process and get folks heavily involved. I think that was it for the next ones we have pretty solid. They will be occurring at the same, what is this, the third or fourth Wednesday of the month?
Towards the end of the month, Wednesday at the end of the month, it will, obviously we'll have to make some allowances for holidays that are coming up, but we will do a better job of getting those dates out in a more timely fashion as we figure out what we're doing as well.